It was a conference room on a Tuesday morning in March. Fluorescent lights, stale coffee. My husband was scrolling his phone, while his lawyer opened my financial disclosure packet. For 5 years, he'd been telling people I had a little Etsy thing. He thought I mixed oils in jars as a hobby. Then his lawyer started reading. Annual revenue for fiscal year 2023, $870,000. Net profit $158,000. 5 full-time employees. A studio space. Contracts with a 16-property hotel chain. A hospice scent program. A wellness brand partnership. His lawyer asked for a 15-minute recess. When they came back, my husband wasn't angry. He just looked confused. He stared at the documents for a long time, and then said almost to himself, "That's not possible." But it was possible. It had been possible the whole time, and all he had to do was look. But let me start from the beginning, because this story isn't really about the money. It's about the night I chose a secret over my marriage. Before I get into the full story, if you're into stories like this, hit like and subscribe. We drop new ones every single day. I met Derek in the fall of 2017 at a friend's housewarming party in Charlotte. He was charming, the kind of person who could walk into any room and find exactly the right conversation. He was a regional sales manager for a medical device company making about $87,000 a year, and he mentioned it casually enough that I thought it was confidence. Later I'd realize it was the only way he knew how to measure himself. But that came later. Here's what makes this story complicated, and I need to say it because everyone wants these stories to be simple. During our first year together, Derek was genuinely good to me. When Lily was born and I went through 3 brutal months of postpartum depression, he picked up everything. He cooked. He cleaned. He held the baby at 3 in the morning so I could sleep. He drove me to therapy appointments and never once made me feel weak for needing them. And there was a night, maybe a month after I started treatment, when I told him I felt like I was failing at the one thing I was supposed to be good at. He sat on the edge of the bed and said, "You're not failing. You're fighting. And that's harder." I need you to understand that version of Derek existed, because what came later wasn't some switch that flipped overnight. It was a slow erosion, and that's what made it so hard to see until I was already deep in it. We got engaged in May of 2019 and married that September. Beautiful ceremony at a vineyard outside Asheville. 72 guests. Now here's where the prenup comes in. My dad is a retired corporate attorney, 31 years at a firm in Raleigh. When I told him I was getting engaged, the first thing out of his mouth wasn't congratulations. It was, "You need a prenuptial agreement." At the time, I thought he was being paranoid. I'd started blending custom scents in our apartment in 2018, making reed diffusers and room sprays, selling them on Etsy mostly to friends and coworkers. Maybe $400 a month. It definitely wasn't worth protecting. Or so I thought. Dad insisted. He said protect what you're building, not just what you have. He drafted it himself. Premarital assets, any business owned independently, intellectual property, all protected and kept separate. There was one clause buried in the language that would matter a lot later. A provision stating that the business had to be funded entirely with non-marital assets, or its own revenue, to maintain protection under the agreement. Derek barely read it. At the signing he said, and I quote, "Sure, I'll sign it. Gotta protect that air freshener money." His brother laughed. My dad didn't. The first year of marriage was fine. Normal. Derek went to work. I took care of Lily and kept mixing scents and filling orders from our spare bedroom. But by early 2020, something unexpected happened that would change everything. A boutique hotel owner in Savannah found my Etsy shop and asked if I could create a custom signature scent for her lobby. She didn't just want a pleasant smell. She wanted an emotional signature, something that would make a guest walk through the front door and immediately feel like they were somewhere specific, somewhere that mattered. I spent 3 weeks on that project, tested 11 different blends. Scent is strange because it bypasses the logical brain entirely. It goes straight to memory, to emotion, to places you forgot you'd been. The blend she chose was built around white tea and fig leaf, with a base note of worn leather. It smelled like the reading room of a house that had been in someone's family for generations. Not nostalgic in a generic way, a specific, like a particular afternoon in a particular place. She called me 2 weeks after the installation. A guest had stopped at the front desk and asked what the smell was because it reminded her of her grandmother's living room. That guest booked a return trip before she'd even checked out. The hotel owner paid me $1,800, and something clicked for me that went beyond revenue. I realized that what I was doing wasn't decorating a space. I was engineering an emotional response. I was building memory into rooms. Turns out there's a whole industry around ambient scenting for commercial spaces. Hotels, spas, high-end retail, medical offices. Big corporate companies charge tens of thousands for it. But the boutique businesses, the independent hotels, the day spas, the local restaurant groups, they couldn't afford those contracts. I was offering something those companies didn't. Custom blends built around what a space should feel like, with the kind of personal attention a corporate sales team will never give you. And the pandemic weirdly helped. When businesses started reopening in 2020 and 2021, they were desperate to make their spaces feel clean and welcoming again. Scent became part of that story. I did a project for a dental practice in Durham that wanted their waiting room to smell less like a dental practice. We went through 8 iterations. The final blend was eucalyptus and cedar with a faint trace of vanilla, warm enough to feel domestic but clean enough to feel professional. The office manager told me their cancellation rate dropped by 15% after the installation. She said patients stopped gripping the armrests in the waiting room. I can't prove the correlation, but she was convinced, and she referred me to 3 other practices. By June of 2020, I was doing about $6,000 a month. By December, $14,000. And somewhere in that stretch, the comments started. Small stuff at first. Still mixing your little potions. At dinner. When are you gonna get a real job? In front of his mother. He'd introduce me at his company events as my wife. She has this little Etsy thing, with a half smile like it was endearing. Like I was a child with a lemonade stand. And here's what's hard to explain. I could have handled the mockery if it had just been about the business, but it started to feel like it was about me. Like Derek had decided early on what I was, the wife with the cute hobby, and any evidence that didn't fit that picture simply didn't register. The more the business grew, the less he seemed to see it. Or maybe the less he wanted to. I tried talking to him about it once, early 2021, told him the revenue was growing, that I was thinking about getting a business license, maybe renting a small workspace. He laughed. Not a cruel laugh. That's what made it worse. A genuine, amused, patronizing laugh. He said, "Babe, you mix oils in jars. It's a hobby. Don't overthink it." So I stopped telling him. I want to be clear about something. I didn't set out to hide a business from my husband. It happened gradually. Every time I shared something I was proud of, he diminished it. So I shared less. And he never asked for more. But there were close calls. In November of 2021, a client called our home line. I don't know how she got the number. Probably from an old business card I'd handed out early on. Derek answered. I heard him say she's not available right now, can I take a message? When I came back in the room, he said some lady called about a scent installation at a hotel in Hilton Head. He looked mildly curious for about 5 seconds. Then he said one of your Etsy customers, and went back to watching football. One follow-up question. That's all it would have taken. What's a scent installation? Why is a hotel calling? How big has this gotten? Any one of those questions would have unraveled everything. He might have been angry. He might have been impressed. He might have wanted in. We might have built it together. But he didn't ask. And I let the moment pass. And I'll be honest about something else, because I'm not going to pretend I'm the hero of every scene in this story. As the business grew, there were moments where I could have pushed through his dismissiveness. I could have sat him down, shown him the numbers, forced the conversation. I chose not to. Part of that was self-protection, but part of it, and this is the part I've had to sit with, was something smaller and pettier. I liked watching the gap grow between what he assumed and what was real. I'm not proud of that, but it's true. We filed our taxes separately every year. My dad had recommended that from the very beginning, back when I was making $400 a month, and it barely mattered. Derek never questioned it. He assumed my income was so small it wasn't worth combining, and the separate filings meant he never saw my numbers. That's the question everyone asks. How did he not know? He didn't know because he never looked, and the way we filed meant he never had to. By mid-2021, I'd moved off Etsy and launched a proper website, hired a contract developer for $3,200 to build it, got my LLC registered in North Carolina. I was landing 2 or 3 commercial scenting contracts a month, mostly hotels and day spas across the Carolinas and Georgia. I brought on 2 people, a part-time assistant to handle retail orders and a contractor who did on-site installations. Derek thought I was going to what he called my craft room a few days a week. I never corrected him. Now here's the part people don't expect, because everyone wants the clean upward trajectory. In August of 2022, I almost lost everything. My biggest client was a boutique hotel group with 11 properties. They represented about 38% of my total revenue. They got acquired by a larger hospitality company that already had their own scenting vendor under contract. They cancelled our agreement with 30 days' notice. In the same month, my installation contractor quit without warning. He'd taken a better offer from one of the big corporate scenting companies. I couldn't blame him, but I had 14 scheduled installations over the next 6 weeks, and nobody to do them. I spent 3 weeks driving across 3 states doing installations myself, learning on the fly, getting it wrong more often than I'll ever admit publicly. There was a day spa outside Asheville. I was doing a relaxation room installation, and I mixed up 2 diffuser units. The room was supposed to smell like lavender and warm stone, something that said close your eyes, you're safe. Instead it ended up smelling like peppermint and black pepper, basically like someone was making a stir-fry in a meditation studio. A woman was mid-massage in the next room and asked her therapist if someone was cooking. The owner asked me to leave, not rudely but firmly. I sat in my car in the parking lot, reprogrammed the unit from scratch, went back in and fixed it. She let me stay on as a client, but barely. And I deserved that barely. I lost 3 other clients that month because the work wasn't good enough. They were right to drop me. The thing nobody tells you about building a business is that the failure doesn't come when you're weak. It comes when you're stretched, when the business has outgrown what you can carry alone, but you haven't built the infrastructure to hold it yet. I was in that gap, and the gap was swallowing me. I was sleeping maybe 4 hours a night. Lily was asking why Mommy looked so tired, and I couldn't tell anyone what was happening. Not Derek, not my friends. The only person who knew the full picture was my dad, and I was 800 miles of pride away from calling him. I finally did call him from a parking lot in Greenville, South Carolina, after losing my 3rd client that month. I cried for 40 minutes straight. I told him I didn't think I could do this anymore. He listened for a long time. Then he said, you don't have to, but decide because you want to stop, not because you're scared. That's not in the highlight reel, but it happened, and it's the reason I kept going. Then came the kitchen floor. I got home at 11, after a 4-hour drive back from a botched installation in Colombia. I walked into the kitchen and just sat down on the tile and stared at nothing. I didn't even take my shoes off. I was so tired that existing felt like an effort. Derek came downstairs. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat down next to me on the floor, his back against the cabinets. We sat there for a few minutes in the quiet, and then he said, whatever this is, you don't have to carry it alone. He was being the version of himself I'd married. The man who sat on the edge of the bed and told me I was fighting, not failing. The man who drove me to therapy and never made me feel small for needing it. He was right there, and I couldn't reach him. I'd been hiding the business for so long that telling the truth had become more terrifying than the business failing. If I told him now, I wasn't just revealing a company. I was revealing that I'd been lying to him for years. About the craft room, about the money, about who I was during the hours he thought I was making candles. The secret had become load-bearing. Removing it meant the whole structure of our marriage would shift, and I didn't know what would be left standing. So I said, I'm just tired, and went to bed. That might be the moment I regret most in this whole story. Not because telling him would have saved the marriage. I think the distance between us had been growing for years by then, from both sides. But because he offered something real, something I actually needed, and I chose the secret over the man. I've turned that night over in my head hundreds of times. What if I'd said, actually, yes, I need to tell you something? What if he'd been angry but then curious? What if he'd wanted to help? What if we'd driven to an installation together and he'd discovered he was good at the client-facing part, the charming the room part, the part he'd always been best at? What if the business had become ours? I'll never know. And that's the kind of loss that doesn't show up on a financial disclosure. What saved the business was a referral. One spa owner I'd worked with recommended me to a restaurant group in Atlanta that was opening 4 new locations. They needed ambient scenting for all 4 spaces. The owner was specific in a way I'd never encountered before. He wanted each restaurant to have a subtly different scent profile that shared the same base note. So there was brand continuity across locations, but each space had its own identity. The Italian place should feel like a different afternoon than the seafood place, but a guest who'd been to both should sense they were part of the same family. That kind of brief would have intimidated me a year earlier. But 3 weeks of doing everything wrong had taught me more about scent engineering than the previous 2 years of doing it mostly right. I developed a shared base of sandalwood and bergamot, then built 4 distinct top-note profiles. The Italian location got crushed basil and warm bread accord. The seafood place got salt air and driftwood. When the owner walked through all 4 finished spaces in one day, he called me that night and said I didn't know a smell could make me feel like I was in 4 different cities without leaving Atlanta. That one contract replaced almost everything I'd lost from the hotel group. I hired a proper installation team, 2 people full-time, and trained them myself over the course of a month. By the end of 2022, I'd recovered. Annual revenue hit $490,000. I had 5 employees. I'd signed a lease on a 1,600 square foot studio space on the east side of Charlotte. I told Derek it was a craft rental. Not a lie exactly, but not the truth either. And Derek was still telling people I had a little Etsy thing, but it had stopped bothering me in the way it used to, because somewhere between the parking lot in Greenville and the kitchen floor, the hurt had calcified into something quieter. Not anger, just distance. I'd stopped wanting him to see me. I'd stopped wanting him to ask. The secret wasn't protecting the business anymore. It was protecting me from having to grieve the partnership we should have had. 2023 was the year the business found its purpose. I landed a contract with a regional hotel chain, 16 properties across the Southeast. That deal was worth $290,000 over 2 years. A wellness brand approached me about co-developing a consumer product line. Revenue was climbing, but the project that changed everything came from a hospice network in the Piedmont region. They asked me to develop calming scent profiles for their family rooms. The rooms where people sit with their dying parents, their dying children. The rooms where families hear the worst news of their lives and then have to just sit in it. I spent a week in those facilities, not designing, just sitting, watching, listening. I sat with a woman whose father was in his final days and asked her what her childhood home smelled like. She closed her eyes and said Sunday mornings. I asked her to be more specific, and she said clean sheets that had been dried outside and something baking. Another family told me about a grandfather's workshop, sawdust and lemon oil and old coffee. A mother sitting vigil for her 20-year-old son described the smell of the beach house where he learned to walk. I wasn't engineering an emotional response anymore. I was trying to bring people home when they couldn't go home, trying to make the worst room they'd ever sit in feel like somewhere safe. We landed on a blend of soft linen, light sandalwood and something close to warm milk. Simple, quiet, the kind of smell that doesn't announce itself but just holds you. One of the nurses told me that a daughter had come out of her mother's room and said the room smelled like her mom's house used to, like being a kid on a Saturday morning. I went back to my studio and cried. Not the parking lot in Greenville kind of crying, a different kind. The kind that comes when you realize the thing you built can do something you never designed it to do. That project paid almost nothing. It's the work I'm proudest of. And it's the work Derek never knew about. The work he could have been part of if he'd ever asked what I did all day. If he'd ever walked into the studio he thought was a craft rental. If he'd been curious, even once, about the wife who came home some nights smelling like sandalwood and crying for reasons she couldn't explain. Revenue for fiscal year 2023, $870,000. Net profit after payroll, rent, materials, insurance and everything else, $158,000. 7 employees. A real company doing real work, in rooms where it mattered. Now here's where the marriage finally came apart, and it wasn't the dramatic confrontation people want it to be. There was no single breaking point. It was just the weight of everything we'd both built between us. In the fall of 2023, while I was going through our financial records with my dad to get a picture of where things stood, I discovered that Derek had taken out a personal loan for $28,000 using our home as collateral. He'd done the paperwork electronically during COVID, when the bank wasn't requiring in-person signatures. I never got a full answer about where the money went, but it told me something I'd been avoiding. We were both hiding things. I'd hidden a company. He'd hidden a debt. We were living in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, and we were strangers. Not enemies. Strangers. And that felt worse. I called a divorce attorney named Patricia Whitfield. At our first meeting, I brought everything. Business tax returns, bank statements, the prenup, the loan documents. She studied it all for about 20 minutes, then looked up and said your father knew what he was doing with this prenup. But we have a problem. The problem was this. When I first started the business in 2018, before the prenup existed, I'd bought my initial supplies from our joint checking account, about $3,800 worth of essential oils, diffuser components, bottles, packaging. Derek's share of that joint account was technically marital funds, and the prenup's protection clause specifically stated that the business had to be funded entirely with non-marital assets or its own revenue. Patricia told me straight, if his lawyer catches this, and he will, they'll argue the business was co-funded with marital money. It probably won't void the entire prenup, but it gives them a foothold. I spent 2 weeks digging through 5 years of bank records, and buried in March of 2019, I found a transfer, $3,800 from my personal savings into the joint checking account. The memo line said replenishing household. I'd put money back into the account around that time, though I wasn't certain it was specifically to cover the supplies. Patricia said honestly, this helps, but it's not airtight. The transfer doesn't reference the business. A good judge could read it either way. We filed in January of 2024. I'm posting this from a throwaway because some of you might figure out what company I'm talking about, and I'm not ready for that conversation yet. Derek was annoyed but not worried. I could hear him on the phone, with his brother treating the whole thing like an inconvenience. He figured he'd get the house, half our savings, standard visitation with Lily and move on. At an early mediation session, he said to his lawyer not quite quietly enough, "She mixes perfume or something. What's there to split?" And that brings us to the moment I told you about at the start. The conference room on a Tuesday morning in March. Derek scrolling his phone, while his lawyer opened my financial disclosure packet. There wasn't a gasp. There was just a slow quiet, the kind that spreads across a table when someone is reading something they can't quite make sense of. All of it laid out in black and white. And one detail I didn't mention before, a company website with over 40,000 followers that he'd never once thought to search for. Derek wasn't angry. That's what I remember most. He just looked confused, like someone had described a version of his life he didn't recognize. But here's what I keep thinking about. It was possible. It had been possible the whole time. It was happening in the next room, in the studio 20 minutes from our house, in the buildings across 3 states where the air smelled different because of what I'd made. It was possible every single day for 5 years, and all he had to do was look. The next 3 months were difficult. Derek's attorney argued that the business was marital property because it grew during the marriage. Patricia showed that the prenup explicitly addressed business appreciation and independent growth. Then his lawyer found the joint account issue. They argued that the $3,800 in startup supplies constituted marital co-investment. Patricia presented the transfer and declarations from 2 accountants, confirming the business had been self-funded from its own revenue after that initial purchase. But here's where the story stops being the clean outcome I wanted. The judge acknowledged the transfer, but ruled that the memo line was ambiguous, and the timing created an unresolved question about intent. She ruled that the $3,800 constituted a partial marital interest in the business's founding capital, and awarded Derek 8% of the independently appraised business value. The appraiser valued the company at $610,000. 8%, $48,800. I had to write Derek a check from the business account, $48,800, not because a court ruled he'd earned it, not because he'd contributed to it, because of an ambiguous memo line on a bank transfer from 5 years earlier. Patricia told me afterward it was a good outcome. She'd seen judges award 20 or 30% on weaker prenups. I know she was right, but I kept thinking about it differently. He got 8% of a company he'd never asked about. If he'd asked, if he'd been curious, if he'd been a partner instead of an audience, he could have had 50. Not through a court order, through a marriage. That's not a victory for either of us. Derek's lawyer also argued that Derek supported the household, which enabled me to build the business. Patricia submitted bank records showing I'd been paying 60% of the mortgage for the last 3 years, plus the discovery of the $28,000 unauthorized loan, which effectively destroyed his credibility. The final outcome: the business, the studio lease, all contracts, all intellectual property stayed with me, minus the 8% buyout. The unauthorized loan was assigned entirely to Derek. The judge ruled he was entitled to 55% of home equity rather than 50%, recognizing the early years when he was the primary earner. With the loan factored in, his total share came to about $41,000. There's one more thing I need to tell you, because this story isn't complete without it. The hotel chain contract, the 16-property deal, the single biggest contract I'd ever signed. The VP of operations who'd signed it was a golf buddy of Derek's former boss. When the divorce proceedings became contentious, and Derek started telling anyone who'd listened that I'd hidden money from him, that VP got uncomfortable. His exact words to me were, "I don't want our brand associated with this kind of situation." They didn't cancel the contract outright. They just didn't renew when the first year ended. $145,000 in annual revenue gone. Not because of my work. My installations were performing well, but because my personal life bled into my professional one in a way I couldn't control. I learned something from that loss. The walls around a business aren't as solid as you think. The people in your life can shake them even if they've never set foot inside. So where is everyone now? It's been about a year since the divorce was finalized. The business did $930,000 in revenue in 2024, even after losing the hotel chain contract. We're up to 7 employees. The wellness brand collaboration launched a consumer product line, going into 140 stores this spring. I took on 2 new hospice networks and a children's hospital. I bought Derek out of the house. I'm sitting in my home office right now, the same room where I used to fill diffuser orders at 2 in the morning, while he slept down the hall. The room he called my craft room. The room where a business was born that he could have built with me. Lily is 5 and starting kindergarten in August. She tells people that Mommy makes buildings smell pretty. She's not wrong. My dad keeps a copy of the prenup in his study, not framed, in a file folder with a sticky note that says good enough. Because it wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. Derek, from what I hear through mutual friends, tells people the divorce was unfair, that I was secretive. He's right about the secretive part. I've had to sit with that. I wasn't secretive out of malice, at least not at first, but I wasn't honest either, and I don't get to pin all of that on him. He dismissed me and I let the distance grow wider instead of confronting it. He offered to help me on a kitchen floor at 11 at night, and I chose the secret over the marriage. Both things can be true. I failed him in ways that are different from how he failed me, but I still failed him. A friend told me recently that Derek found my company's website. She said he spent a long time going through it. The about page, the portfolio, the client list. She said he looked at the hospice page for a while, and I hope when he read about the family rooms and the Sunday morning smell, and the daughter who said her mother's room felt like being a kid again, I hope he understood something. Not that I'd succeeded. That's just numbers. But that the thing he called a hobby was trying to make the hardest rooms in the world feel like home. And he could have been part of that. That's not a revenge story. That's just a sad one. My daughter asked me the other day what I do for work. I knelt down and told her I help people feel safe in a room just by walking into it. She said that's a weird job. She's also not wrong. So here's what I want to ask you. Have you ever had someone close to you refuse to see what you were building, not because they couldn't, but because seeing it would have changed the story they'd already decided was true? I'd love to hear about it in the comments.